Can wealthy guys like Microsoft founder Bill Gates help to solve the technical problems of poverty? Or do they actually make things worse, using charity dollars to prop up dictators? Well, a new book called The Tyranny of Experts says the answer is clear. I'm PJTV's Scott Ott, joined now by Stephen Green and Bill Whittle. And men, William Easterly's new book, subtitled Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor, makes a devastating case against the way global developers and donors have done it for nearly a century. Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up. Bill Gates loves the United Nations Millennium Development Goals.
I love the Millennium Development Goals. I think they're the best idea for focusing the world on fighting global poverty that I've ever seen. Thanks to these goals, not only UN agencies, but the world at large knows the key measures of poverty, hunger, health, and education. Some of the numbers are good and some are not. But the fact that the world is focusing on these numbers is excellent.
But in The Tyranny of Experts, Easterly points out several problems with that, including, but not limited to, the following. The experts work with unreliable and often conflicting data, draw unsubstantiated conclusions, ignore contrary evidence, treat the third world countries as if they're helpless and have no history, and idolize autocratic strongmen so that dictators can use development dollars to tighten their grips on power. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, what did you think of the play? Well, Stephen Green, is it possible that the brilliant Bill Gates, a world-class, high-tech problem solver who, frankly, ushered in the information age and transformed the world's economy, could be stymied by simple Stone Age problems like food, water, and sanitation?
I got two words for you. Microsoft Bob. I don't know if you remember this, but it was a front end for Windows that was supposed to make your computer into this friendly little house where you'd click on things and there were cute little animations. Microsoft Bob was such a flop. I can't even begin to tell you what a big flop it was. It was hugely promoted, nobody bought the thing, and to make matters worse, the world's worst font, the unspeakable font, Comic Sans. That's right, Comic Sans was developed just for Microsoft Bob. And you want to make things even worse. The woman who invented Microsoft Bob, the developing force behind Microsoft Bob, well, her name is Melinda. And her name now is Melinda Gates. Bill Gates married the woman who invented Microsoft Bob. Experts don't know anything. That's the problem. We solve our problems when we can solve our problems. We can't always. But we solve them ourselves with the help of our families and our loved ones. This is how we do things. This is how free people do things. When you shovel money at dictators, what you get is Microsoft Bob on the tyrannical scale.
Clippy says, do you need some help with judgment and discernment?
Yeah.
Bill Whittle, you never do full Clippy.
Never go full Clippy.
You recently, Bill, you did a video debunking the notion that it, quote, takes a village to solve problems. Why don't smart guys like Bill Gates or Barack Obama, the entire United Nations for that matter, why don't they seem to get this?
Well, let's make some clarifications. First of all, Bill Gates is a smart guy. Barack Obama isn't. I'm all about truth and responses. Watching Bill Gates in front of the United Nations, I had two thoughts. My first thought of him standing in front of the United Nations was, you would think that with $60 billion, you could get a decent haircut and a decent tie. That just doesn't seem like too much to ask to me, frankly, for a guy with $60 billion. But really, now we get down to the point, right? Because when you look at the situation in the third world with extreme poverty, let's take Africa as an example, the situation seems to be virtually unwinnable. It is appallingly, awfully difficult. And so the only thing that shows any promise, the only thing that seems to work out there ever, and I've looked at this very carefully, is this idea of these microloans where somebody lends somebody $100, $200, they buy a sewing machine, they set up a little tiny little shop in some backwards village, they sell clothes to their neighbors, they make a little bit of money, they hire some people, and an economy begins to develop. Now, with the Gates Foundation and the $30 billion or 20 or whatever is endowed with, you could put so many microloans out there that they really could, in fact, develop an economy from the ground up. It would start with very unsexy sexy things like people taking used tires and cutting them into sandals and then selling the sandals. But it would be an economy that would actually work. We didn't just come into the information age here. You know, my grandparents were coal miners and mill workers. But the problem with the microloans is you don't get to stand in front of the United Nations and talk about how awesome things are if you decide to go that road. So the final thing I'll say on this, Scotty, is Bill Gates did not get Microsoft off the ground by a gigantic $1 trillion loan investment by some third world or some multinational organization. He started it in a garage, just like Jobs and Wozniak did, essentially just like Thomas Edison did, essentially like all these people did. This top-down approach ends up with one thing. We saw it in the 1980s. When you give large sums of money to the third world, what you get are international airports with 12,000-foot runways and 4-lane highways that extend 8 miles out into the jungle and then come to a complete stop. It doesn't work. It's never worked. But they like it because of the ego.
Well, back in seminary, I caused a minor dust-up when I suggested one day to a professor that Maslow's hierarchy of needs could be inverted. In other words, instead of starting with food, shelter, and basic survival, it could start with self-actualization. Instead of eking out an existence until you someday achieved inner peace and confidence, if you started with a sense of meaning and purpose, you'd be more likely to meet basic needs for yourself and for others. Now, while the Tyranny of Experts devotes hundreds of pages to relentlessly eviscerating the status quo at places like the World Bank, the United Nations, and the Gates Foundation, its message is rather simple. Liberty comes first. As William Easterly writes, the general picture is that poor people, like rich people, do not like being told what to do. They like to make their own choices. Well, in 1850, the United States had an average standard of living comparable to modern Ghana in West Africa.
Right.
We didn't emerge from poverty and finally achieve liberty. We declared liberty, and it led to prosperity. For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and the entire Trifecta crew at PJTV.com, I'm Scott Ott.